There is a thirst throughout our land today for civic leadership, not the kind of leadership that wrests political control by vanquishing opponents, but the kind that harnesses energy and gets us all pulling in the same direction. Not a leader who imposes objective truth from on high, but one who seeks subjectivity and engages our empathy. John Kitzhaber is such a leader. His history is one of forging bipartisan efforts, of helping us identify with the others in our community lives. Sworn in as Oregon's governor in January 1995, Kitzhaber is known nationwide for authoring the groundbreaking Oregon Health Plan. He's credited both with crafting the plan and for bringing together diverse interest groups to pass the law, which took effect in February of 1994. Kitzhaber has also received recognition for his many accomplishments in the field of environmental stewardship, including the prestigious Newberger Award from the Oregon Environmental Council, while at the same time garnering support from his constituents in the timber industry for his efforts on their behalf for their concerns. As many of us know, he is also an accomplished fly fisherman who enjoys Oregon's wild and scenic rivers. And in this session, he is sponsoring a fish recovery program, which has again attracted unlikely allies. Never will his leadership be so tested as during the current session, because he needs to seek not convenient middle ground, but a common vision which will move us forward in concerted action. And he needs to do this at the same time that he's laying the groundwork for his own reelection in a time of cutbacks. Notice I did not say the K word. He needs to promote a budget which his successor, Senate President Brady Adams, has labeled an attempt to hold Oregon's children hostage. 7 centuries ago, Dante reminded us that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a time of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. Based on past experience, I don't think there's any danger of Governor Kitzhaber's venturing into Dante's Inferno during this next session, although he may feel like it occasionally. But he cannot fail to rise to the very real crises which face Oregonians. And those crises pose both dangers and opportunities for the leadership we hope and have come to expect to see from him. So we ask you, Governor, Doctor, how are you going to bring about community healing and lead us to a healthy whole after the scars left by Ballot Measure 47? Please join me in welcoming back to the City Club podium for his second State of the State address, Governor John Kitzhaber.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me start by saying again what an honor it is to have this opportunity to appear once again before the Portland City Club. Your organization, I think, has often led the way in terms of exploring and promoting innovative public policy. And in that sense, I think you typify Oregon. This club has provided a thoughtful forum and a relief, really, from what's become kind of a soundbite-ridden world of modern politics. And for that very reason, I feel very comfortable here, because one of the things that I have definitely failed at is that 8-second soundbite for the 45-second television story that compresses years of work and months of effort and billions of dollars of spending into that 20 choice words pithily delivered in an even and modulated tone. I'm clearly going to make my friends in the press work a little harder than that to find the soundbite in this speech today, because today I'd like to talk about our state's budget, and I'd like to try to propose a way that we can take a big step forward in terms of moving our entire education continuum, keeping our commitment to providing health care and other human services to vulnerable individuals in our state, and return surplus income tax revenues to those who need them the most. In this address, I'm going to refer to the budget that has been presented by the legislative leadership as either the leadership budget or the Republican budget. That is not meant to have a partisan overtone. It is simply an observation that this budget was produced by the Republican leadership in the legislature. But first, I'd like to add a little perspective to the budget debate that we're facing in Salem today. And to do that, I think it would be appropriate to quote from Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I think that's how I feel about Oregon today, because rarely in Oregon's history has this state been doing as well as we're doing in 1997. Yet 15 years ago, if you recall, that was not the case. We were a state in a deep depression. Unemployment was over 20% in my Roseburg Senate district. People were leaving the state of Oregon. There was simply no opportunity here at home. Today, it's clearly different. Unemployment is low. Job growth and economic growth and income growth are high. In fact, the biggest economic problem you face in this part of the state is actually a labor shortage. So there's no other way to put it. Oregon is on a roll today, the very best of times. But what about our public institutions? What about our colleges, our universities? What about our schools and our libraries and our parks? In an era of expanding prosperity, are we taking care of the very public investments that help create that prosperity? And quite frankly, I don't think we are. Our funding for the state schools has not kept pace with inflation. It has not kept pace with the growth in student enrollment. It's not kept pace with the need for technology, or perhaps most importantly, with our very own demand for higher standards of performance from our students. So ironically, at a time when we are asking more than ever before of our students and of our teachers, we are giving them less to work with. Our universities have seen an explosion in tuition, over 80% in the last 6 years. We've seen faltering course offerings. Over a third of Oregon's parks are ready to close. Perhaps we can keep them open for this budget cycle, but I have seen no legislative plan that will provide them with a long-term stable funding source or a plan that will begin to deal with millions of dollars of deferred maintenance. So in short, in an era of private wealth, we are experiencing public poverty. In fact, if you look at the entire terrain of public services, the only one that is not underfunded today is our prison system. Surely the worst of times. This is not a sustainable course. This is a course which slowly erodes the foundation of our very quality of life in this state. And worse, I believe it is a breach of faith with the generations which bestowed our Oregon on us. It is a failure to care for a very precious heritage. That's why last December I proposed what I called my investment budget. And I want to acknowledge to you here, particularly in Portland, that the level of K-12 funding in that budget was inadequate. However, I proposed as much as I thought we could responsibly recommend last December, given our revenue forecast and given the passage of Ballot Measure 47. Nonetheless, that budget was, and I believe remains, a budget that begins to turn the corner on half a decade of neglect. It provides funds to improve the entire continuum of education from pre-kindergarten through postgraduate training. It moves us ahead on K-12 funding. My investment budget freezes tuition at our post-secondary institution, creates a graduate engineering program in the metropolitan area, provides funds for computers and technologies in grade schools and high schools, and moves Head Start funding to a level which can serve 50% of those youngsters who are eligible. It also calls for new revenues. Revenues to fund salmon restoration and improve water quality, revenues to permanently fund our park system, and to maintain our transportation system. And my budget calls for an expansion of the Oregon Health Plan to 43,000 new beneficiaries, most of them working Oregonians who pay taxes to help provide health care to others, but who can't afford health care benefits for themselves or for their families. But as the old saying goes, the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. And there's a reason that saying is so old, because it is so true. I was informed by the legislative leadership that my budget was dead on arrival. Well, being an emergency room doctor in real life, I have never quite accepted dead on arrival as an actual diagnosis. It runs, I'm glad to say, counter to my experience as a physician and also to my experience as a former legislator. Instead, the Republican leadership has released a budget which I can most charitably characterize as disappointing, and perhaps more bluntly as a proposal which continues a half a decade of disinvestment. Before I go into my specific objections about this budget, let me sound one positive note, and that was referenced in the introduction. It is the Oregon Salmon Restoration Plan. I have been extremely heartened by the strong bipartisan support for this Oregon approach to species restoration, and I particularly want to compliment House Speaker Lynn Lundquist for the leadership he has shown to generate support for this plan in the legislature. I wish I could report agreement on more elements of the Republican budget priorities, but I simply can't. So let me take this opportunity to highlight perhaps 4 of the most glaring deficiencies. First, in the area of education, I believe the leadership budget is a failure. It fails not only K through 12, but the entire continuum of education. The budget eliminates entirely my Head Start funding package. This means that thousands of kids who would otherwise have been eligible for this successful preschool program, who would otherwise have been given a better preparation for their K through 12 experience, won't have that advantage. These children will not get a Head Start. The leadership budget cuts in half funding for the graduate engineering program in Oregon, ignoring a remedy to one of the most widely recognized problems in our state's system of higher education. The fact that many of the good jobs that this economy is turning out are not going to Oregonians because we are not training enough engineers and technicians. Surely we can do better. The Republican budget also eliminates funding for 2 of the most basic investments in our future. First, resources to train our teachers to teach the Education Act of the 21st century. And second, the ability to purchase computer technology for our grade schools and for our high schools. But this is not the worst failure of this particular budget. The worst feature is the K through 12 appropriation, which is insufficient to meet the needs of Oregon's primary and secondary schools as we approach the 21st century. It is an appropriation that will result in significant teacher layoffs in many districts, larger class sizes, no music, no art, no computers. In short, it reduces the chances of our children being successful in the ever more competitive world outside of high school, and I simply find that unacceptable. And it is particularly unacceptable in the economy and in the economic growth and complexion that this state is enjoying today. So the question is this: if we cannot afford to make these kinds of common sense investments in our educational system now, when the economy is strong and when the economy is growing, then when can we afford to make them? The second major deficit in the leadership budget is the level of funding for the Oregon Health Plan. Last November, Oregon voters approved overwhelmingly an increase in the cigarette tax for the purpose of maintaining and expanding the Oregon Health Plan. That tax will raise approximately $140 million every 2 years. I have proposed using about half of that for maintaining the existing health plan by replacing a sunsetting cigarette tax, and the other half to expand the plan to lower-income working Oregonians. My proposal would bring health care within reach for another 43,000 people, lowering the rate of uninsured in this state to 8%. The leadership budget, on the other hand, proposes using less than $15 million of this new money for expansion, bringing health care to only about 11,000 people. And this, too, is unacceptable. I believe this constitutes a breach of faith with the voters of this state, and I will do all that I can to resist it. The Republican budget is also silent on something that I expected, quite frankly, to see more leadership on. Both the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate appeared before the Oregon Parks Commission last year, asked them to keep the parks open, and promised in return to bring before this legislature a stable, long-term funding source for our park system. As of today, there is no such plan. I've suggested a beverage container tax, which would have accomplished that purpose, as well as provided funding for salmon restoration and for cleaning up our streams, but that proposal, too, was diagnosed dead on arrival. I just want you to know that this is an issue that is extremely important to me, and I think it is one that is extremely important to all Oregonians. And I'm not going to give up on it until there is another proposal on the table. I haven't seen it yet, I haven't heard it yet, but this is not an issue that I think this legislature can afford to ignore. Finally, this budget isn't really balanced at all. It relies on almost $87 million in unspecified, to-be-named-later cuts. Now, let me tell you from 8 years as a presiding officer in the legislature that it is a lot easier to put those cuts on paper than it is to find them in the budgets and get the votes to pass them. And given the cuts that are already in that budget, you can rest assured that most of that $87 million is going to come from program cuts in human resources, in economic development, in public safety, and in other important areas. So in other words, the leadership has not yet fully shared with Oregonians what services and programs are going to be cut in order to balance this budget. To summarize, I believe that this leadership budget fails Oregonians. It underfunds the entire continuum of education. It breaks faith with the voters' desire to expand health care coverage for working Oregonians. It proposes $87 million in unspecified program cuts, and it stands silent on how to help our park system. I must say, however, that I am grateful that the Republican leadership has finally put forth a budget that reflects their priorities and which will allow us to begin to move the session along. And while I do not agree with the priorities that are reflected in this document, and have been somewhat critical of them, as Abraham Lincoln said, he has the right to criticize who has the heart to help. In other words, criticism, in order to be constructive, needs to be accompanied by specific alternatives. So in that spirit, today I would like to propose a middle path, a compromise approach that recognizes and attempts to honor the Republican position on both budget cuts and on returning the 2% kicker, but which still makes the investments critical to Oregon's future. I am hopeful that this proposal will be viewed in the spirit in which it is made, not a partisan approach, but an Oregon approach, one that seeks common ground and a common vision for Oregon's future. I want to stress that this proposal remains true to my fundamental principles concerning the budgeting process. That while we all agree that additional resources are needed for the K-12 system, we must achieve that objective in a balanced way. In short, we cannot fund the K-12 portion of the education budget at the expense of pre-kindergarten and post-secondary education, and we can't fund education in general at the expense of the rest of the vital services that the state must provide. Let me repeat that. We cannot fund the K-12 portion of the education budget at the expense of pre-kindergarten and post-secondary education, and we cannot fund education in general at the expense of the other important services and programs that other Oregonians depend on. So I want you to know that this is a very bedrock principle of mine, and while I will work with you to increase the size of the pie, whatever budget we ultimately adopt this session must reflect a balanced allocation of resources among a number of areas, including but not limited to education. Now, with that understanding, I'm proposing today, first, that we put into the K-12 system an additional $200 million above the figure in my investment budget, $110 million above the level in the Republicans' recommended budget, for a total K-12 appropriation of $4.16 billion. To help finance this investment, I will do my part. I will work with the Republican legislative leadership as well as with my Democratic colleagues to find acceptable cuts in my proposed investment budget. Second, I propose that all eligible Oregonians receive a kicker rebate up to a cap that reflects the amount due to the average Oregon taxpayer. This means that those Oregonians who most need it will receive their full rebate. And while the majority of the corporate kicker will also be invested in education, I will propose a modest business rebate as well. Now let me go into some details. First, K through 12 education. As you know, my original budget recommendation last December put just under $4 billion into primary and secondary education. Now, the legislative leadership has been quick to point out that this represents over a 12% increase from the current budget level, and that therefore schools must be adequately funded. The fact is that this appropriation also reflects the money we had to put in to replace the property tax revenue that was lost to our school system by Ballot Measure 47. And when you back that money out, the actual increase for our schools, our K through 12 systems, is just about 1%. And that is why many districts, including this one, were still facing serious teacher layoffs and serious program reductions under my so-called investment budget. Nonetheless, as I indicated, that was as much as I thought I could put in December responsibly, given Measure 47, given the revenue forecast, and given the other demands on the general fund. Today, because of an improved revenue forecast, the March revenue forecast, and because of my commitment and willingness to go back into my proposed budget and to help find some acceptable cuts, I believe that we can now allocate another $200 million to K through 12. Now, what does that mean? First, it means that the vast majority of Oregon school districts will not be facing teacher layoffs and increased class sizes. Second, it means that we will achieve our equity target. And I do have a revenue run that is available today that shows the impact on this on every district in the state of Oregon. So you can look at it and see what it means for you and for your district. When you look at that run, you will also see that a few districts, including this one, are still not made whole by this increased expenditure. Clearly, they will be much better than they would be without an additional $200 million in the budget. Portland, for example, will get almost $100 more per pupil than they would under the current Republican proposal. But they will still face cuts that I expect are not acceptable to their constituents. So to those districts, let me say this. My compromise proposal that I'm suggesting today is balanced. It produces a balanced budget without assuming any revenue from the upcoming May revenue forecast. If our economy continues to perform over the next couple months, and there is no indication that it will not, there should be additional resources available in May, and I will work with you to ensure that the first call on those resources is into our primary and secondary educational system. Let me just also mention that there are about 50 districts, predominantly rural, predominantly very small, less than 200 students, which have high costs for a variety of unique reasons, and I would suggest dealing with those in the context of the formula. And I also want to add that this substantial increase in investment in our educational system must be accompanied by increased accountability for how those dollars are spent. And I expect teachers and administrators and school districts and parents to work with me over the next couple months to make sure that we can demonstrate accountably how we're going to invest those dollars and the return that the taxpayers of Oregon are going to get for that investment. With regard to budget cuts, as I said, I will step up to the plate. I am willing to discuss a reevaluation of the scope of some of my proposed investments, and I am willing to look at how we can responsibly save money in our correctional system. The new prison population forecast, for example, suggests that there may be some significant savings this biennium in the Department of Corrections by delaying the construction of one of the new facilities necessitated by Ballot Measure 11. The point is that if there is a willingness on the part of the legislative leadership to reach this compromise, then I will go over every budget line by line to make sure that we make it work. My compromise proposal for the 2% kicker involves two components. First, committing the majority of the corporate kicker to education is, I believe, justified not only by the need in our educational budget and our workforce needs, but also by the fact that the business community has realized a disproportionate level of property tax relief under Ballot Measure 5 and Ballot Measure 47. Nonetheless, I also believe that it is important to provide a modest rebate for the business community as well, and essentially treat them in a similar fashion to the way we're treating the personal kicker. The second part of my kicker proposal does involve the personal kicker. And what I'm proposing is that all eligible Oregonians will receive a rebate, as I mentioned, up to a cap that reflects the average rebate for the average tax filer. Again, this approach recognizes not only the need in our educational budget for additional resources, but also the fact that many low-income Oregonians, in fact, need their kicker rebate to make ends meet in 1997. In short, what I am saying to you today is that we are within striking distance of a budget that will keep our K-12 system whole, that will maintain our commitment to pre-kindergarten and post-secondary education, that will adequately fund the Oregon Health Plan and other critical elements of our general fund budget, from public safety to human resources to economic development to natural resources, and which will allow us to return income tax revenues to those in this state who need them the most. As you know, I deeply believe that it is important to invest the proceeds of a strong economy in the infrastructure on which that economic growth depends, things like education and transportation and good environmental stewardship. The fact is that we have the financial ability in Oregon today to do that. But we also need the political consensus to make that happen. And what I am proposing today, I believe, offers the basis for building that kind of bipartisan consensus. In closing, let me just say to you that as the budget debate unfolds over the next few months, I would ask all of you to remember that this is not just a debate about numbers and percentages. It is a debate about people. It's a debate about Oregonians and about our quality of life. It's a debate about whether some working Oregonians will have access to basic health care services for themselves and their families, and about whether we will offer compassion and support to vulnerable and frail members of this society. It's a debate about whether kids will have class sizes small enough to actually learn, about whether they will have textbooks and access to the technology that's so important in this world of ours. It's a debate about whether Oregon high school graduates will be able to afford to go to an Oregon college or university, and about whether Oregonians will land the good jobs that this economy is turning out. It's about adequate housing. It's about safe neighborhoods. It's about reducing traffic congestion. It's about preserving one of the nation's great park systems. It's about clean watersheds. It's about saving the salmon. In short, this is not an impersonal accounting exercise. This is about Oregon's future and about our will, and indeed about our responsibility to defend and to pass on to the next generation that unique quality of place that makes Oregon so special to all of us. Thank you.
Governor, thank you for another vigorous presentation on the condition of our state. And now for today's first question. Like another chief executive of an executive branch of government in America, you must advance your agenda in concert with a legislative branch of government that is controlled by the political party that is opposite from your own. What advice would you give, if asked, by that other chief executive about how to accomplish positive change in such a political environment?
Lock the bedroom door would be the first. I think that most of the problems that are confronting Oregon, and I believe most of the problems that are confronting the nation, I mean, the problems that really make a difference in people's lives when they wake up and when they go about their daily activities aren't partisan issues. Education isn't partisan. Healthcare, afflictions hit people regardless of their party registration. Cleaning up the airshed, traffic congestion. These are issues that affect Oregonians or on a larger scale, Americans. And I think that if we can reserve the political give and take to the campaign, I deeply believe that once the election is over, we have to cease being Republicans and Democrats, and we have to become Oregonians working in service of the people of the state. And I think this legislature ultimately will rise to that challenge, and that we'll have a good session. Now I stay up here, all right.
Jay Formick, City Club member, Governor Kitzhaber. As you know, Senate Joint Resolution number 12 threatens to emasculate the land use planning laws of the state of Oregon. As you know as well, the administrative branch of government will have little to do with it should it pass both houses of the legislature. My question to you is, what can you do, what will you do to prevent SJR 12 from becoming law?
And I believe SJR 12 is the takings
That's correct.
bill similar to the bill 600, was it, that I vetoed last year in the Rose
Right.
Garden, the famous event. Don't ever let me do that again. There are actually two resolutions, different numbers, but do substantially the same thing, and there are a number of statutes. The first thing I will do is I'm beginning to activate the folks that I know around the state who care about defeating those kinds of measures, and we're going to go to work over on the House side and see if we can actually prevent the referral. I know that there are many members on both sides of the aisle who understand the importance of being able to have a responsible regulatory framework to ensure a high quality of life. If it does get on the ballot, I will take an extremely active role around the state in trying to defeat it.
Thank you.
Governor, I'm John Mignano, member of Portland City Club, and I work with the Washington State Department of Transportation. I've appreciated your leadership in the past and present on transportation issues, multimodal approaches to transportation, but one of the latest cuts, $6 million, would remove the high-speed passenger train service from the Willamette Valley, and after June 30th, 1997, relegate passengers, people, transportation to a couple throughway buses so that we miss the high speed in Washington and California. I'm asking if you could make a comment about that.
Well, I have been and remain a very strong supporter of mass transit in general and high-speed rail in particular. I think it is much cheaper and much more environmentally responsible to have that up the Willamette Valley than a couple extra lanes on I-5 that'll fill up probably faster than we build them. The challenge is how do you get that appropriation back into the budget? And I guess my general reflection of the budget that was presented is a budget that was driven by the position, the very early position the leadership made that we will not use any of the kicker resources available to us. So the cuts, if you look at them, don't reflect any pattern of philosophy. And if one really wanted to reduce costs of this state long term, you would invest in things like high-speed rail. So I don't think that there's a political philosophy that resulted in it coming out. I think it was just a victim of the budget crunch, which is good news, because I think if we can get more resources on the table, that is one of the areas that I think we are very likely to be able to restore, and I will certainly work towards that end.
Barry Anderson, City Club member. A lot of us don't want that kicker and would be happy to give it back if we were invited to do so in a collective fashion. I wonder if you could provide such an invitation.
Please.
Laura Gracer, City Club member. How does the state-sponsored gambling fit into the big picture, in your view?
Well, it's definitely a part of the big picture, unfortunately. I guess the biggest problem we've got today is that we've got a big-time gambling operation going in Oregon that has developed over time without any cogent social policy framework to guide it. We've never made an affirmative decision about exactly what role we want gaming to play in funding state programs, and we're reaching a point where public policy will be dictated by gambling policy. We saw that, a little bit of that discussion last session. What I'm striving to do on that end is twofold. There's two types, broad categories of gambling in Oregon. You've got the state-sponsored gambling and you've got the tribal gaming. They are sovereign entities authorized under the United States Congress to conduct these activities, so they have to be dealt with somewhat differently. I'm trying to develop a policy for tribal gaming that would restrict through agreement, because this has to be done in a government-to-government compact, restrict a maximum of one gambling operation per tribe, to increase the level of state police involvement in securing the integrity of the games, and caps on the number of tables in the take. That's one category. That one concerns me far less than the expansion of state-sponsored gambling because of the general fund dependence. So I feel very strongly that I will do all I can to block any further expansion of state-sponsored gambling, that I will that we need to develop, I think, some statutory parameters about how we use those resources, that is, leaving and ending balance, and gradually trying to wean state operating revenue off of that gaming over time. We are close, I would say. Mr. Lazenby, my legal counsel, and I have been working on a white paper which should be ready in the very near future that will outline sort of the statutory or the policy framework we think should contain and manage gambling in the state.
Governor, Dr. Edward Press, City Club member, I applaud and concur completely with your suggestion and your investment budget for $200 million from K to 12 grade schools. My question relates, however, to the increased accountability for teachers. Accountability and evaluation of services is very difficult, and some teachers are frozen with tenure and they're there for years and years. My question is, can you give me some suggestions in this difficult area of accountability and evaluation as to what you see as possible measures of accountability? Are you going to say increased grades for the children, some sort of peer evaluation? Can you give me one or two suggestions in the area of this rather difficult accountability problem?
I think we need accountability at a couple of levels. I think the focus in the legislature right now in the form of Senate Bill 650 is accountability of the individual teacher. I think there are some issues inside Senate Bill 650 that merit discussion. I think as it's currently written, it's nothing that I can support because it goes way too far in the other direction. But I do think some changes can be made in the tenure system. But teachers do have to have due process. I would object to anything that eliminated their ability to have some job security. But I do think we need to look at the methods that we use to reduce teachers when, in fact, that becomes necessary. In many districts, it is done strictly on seniority, which has some merits. But if you, because of the seniority system, put a teacher who doesn't speak a second language into teaching a Spanish class, you haven't really served the district, and I think in some ways the current system discriminates against minority teachers because some of them, particularly as we get more people coming in who are teaching English as a second language, generally in many cases have lower levels of seniority. I think that we do need to ensure that our teachers have the ability to teach and demonstrate competency in the new Education Act of the 21st century, but we have to provide them the resources to do that. Let me shift gears very briefly to what I think is the larger question of accountability, and that's system accountability. Right now, the debate that we have in K through 12 is about what your per pupil expenditure is, which is sort of what drives the debate in Salem, whether your district got more or less money than it got last year. Per pupil expenditure doesn't really tell you very much about what happens in the school. And we have a school system right now that basically generates financial data as though it was still a locally funded and locally operated system, but it isn't. It is a state-funded and operated system now. So you can't go into a district and find out how much money is spent inside the classroom, outside the classroom, how much is spent on math versus English. We need that information. And I've got a process going. It's another one of my famous Kitzhaber process without product endeavors. But the idea is to try to quantify how much it costs to deliver, let's say, the certificate of initial mastery in Portland versus Grants Pass. So the measure of equity becomes an outcome rather than an arbitrary per pupil expenditure. If we can get that information in place, then we can change the school funding debate from how do we get more money to what do we want to buy and how do we pay for it. That then gets you system efficiency, which is where the big bucks are. And it's a complicated, challenging task, but I think we need to undertake it, and we need to do it in a way that brings the teachers with us, because the teachers have to be supported and honored in this process, and if you try to do it through reforms that essentially leaves the teaching staff behind, you're not going to get the product you want in any event. I think we can do that.
Thank you.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. Governor, you have recognized the importance of transportation with your transportation initiative. And however, it's very important alternative transportation. And you heard about high-speed rail. In Portland, of course, it may be light rail. It may be buses. It really need alternatives. It looks like the legislature will consider a gas tax increase. That could mean trouble because of the constitutional restriction. But there is a bill, H.J.R. 80, which has been introduced, and that would allow a vote of the people for flexibility at the local level. Specifically, will you actively support H.J.R. 80?
Well, I will actively support flexible funding for our transportation system. That may ultimately be the vehicle by which to do it. I have taken a somewhat different approach. I've suggested an access fee as a part of, let me back up. I've suggested that we break the transportation funding into two pots, really, one for preservation and maintenance, and I do believe the weight mile tax and the gas tax does reflect a good cost responsibility for preserving this integrity of the existing road service. For new expansion, that's driven by congestion, not by wear and tear on the road service, so you need a different funding mechanism, and I've suggested an access fee to provide us a source of flexible funding. My position is that I will sign a gas tax increase and weight mile increase for preservation and maintenance, but I'm not going to sign a gas tax increase for new capital construction unless that package includes some way to give people alternatives to driving by themselves in their cars.
H.J.R. 80 would do that. I hope you will support.
And you may be right. If you saw the Willamette Week, I was the rogue of the week last week. If you read Willamette Week, which I rarely do, but it was because they had a diagram of what I just explained to you, and their comment was that it would probably be simpler to change the Constitution than to explain my visual aids. So.
Absolutely. I think we got to make sure that the money can be used for alternative transport, particularly at the local level. So remember, H.J.R. 80. Thank you.
80.
Sandy Marin, City Club member. There's been a lot of discussion about reforming the ballot initiative in Oregon. Do you think it's needed? And if so, what would you like to see happen?
What I'd like to see happen probably won't ever get out of the box, but I think it does need reforming. I think that it needs preservation too. We have to have the initiative process. I'm a great supporter of that access, but I think the process has a number of flaws. I guess that the biggest is that there needs to be some review of the initiative once it's been written, so that that we have some assurance that it does what the sponsors think it does. Measure 47 is a perfect example of the rhetoric about the bill was pretty clear. It's very poorly drafted, and it is enormously ambiguous. I don't think most people knew they were voting on double majorities. I think they thought they were voting on something to reduce the property taxes. People understand that, and I think the legislature will make sure that that happens. So if you had a way where, after the signatures had been gathered, there's an opportunity for the legislature or some other body to simply go through and do an analysis, a fiscal analysis, and an analysis of the impact, I think that would be an enormous step in the right direction. I would also limit the signature gatherers and pay them by the hour rather than by signature to try to reduce some of the incentive of carrying signatures. And I would probably want to increase the number of signatures required to make a change in the Constitution. There are things that get into the Constitution. Measure 17 is another one that's going back. That's the prison work measure. It's a huge, giant, hundreds of words amendment to the Constitution that you can't change. So I think those 3 or 4 things. The problem, of course, is to amend the initiative process, you have to file an initiative. And it has to be done in a way that I think people view as constructive, not trying to limit folks' access to that form of governance.
Yes, I'm Peter Heuser, a City Club member. You referred to what you thought was a breach of faith by the Republicans in coming out with their budget. I'm wondering, in view of Measures 5 and 47, perhaps it could be said that a majority of Oregonians really do think government should be smaller, taxes should be lower. Don't you think it could be referred to as a breach of faith by not coming out with a budget that cuts spending or at least substantially slows the increase in spending?
I think one could make that argument. I wouldn't for the following reasons. I think that people, and you know, I have no empirical evidence to substantiate it. I guess it's just a sense I have. I don't believe that people, when they voted for 47 or voted for Measure 5, wanted to do violence to the school system. I don't believe that that's what they were voting for. And there is a somewhat schizophrenic aspect to our voters. If the voters want to reduce government, they wouldn't have passed Ballot Measure 11. Half of the increased positions in this budget are due to voter-mandated increases in our correctional system. And how do you define government? I mean, our schools is government. Our public safety system is government. The Oregon Health Plan is government. That's not to say that we can't do a much better job in how we spend the public dollars, but I don't think the initiative process is a reflection that people want significant reductions in those core important services.
Eric Sten, City Club member. Governor, I really appreciate your compromise proposal, particularly on the schools and the kicker, and I think you're right on the right track. As you well know, and we don't have a lot of time, I'm preaching to the choir, our school system is on the brink, and if the middle class leaves it, we're going to lose our city, everything we've built for. There's been a lot of strategy, and maybe it's not enough strategy, on how citizens in Portland should interact with this legislature. There's some sense that maybe we should keep our mouths shut because we're going to make the rural legislators angry, and so my question is a specific one. How can we help you pass this budget? How can we help get your kicker? Starting with the citizens in this room, how can we help your message be heard? And what would be the most productive way for Portland to do that with this legislature and your administration? Because we need the money for the schools.
Well, I mean, the issue this session is really a resource question. It always is, particularly in the 90s. And the resources is around the 2% kicker. And I believe that honest men and women can disagree about what we should do about that. I've been very candid about what I believe. If the pie is going to get any bigger, then we have to use some of those resources, which are in fact the product of an error in forecasting. It's not a tax increase. It's whether you want an income tax reduction right now when you have these problems with your schools. So you need to talk to your legislators, I think, about bringing into play some portion of those resources, and I would stipulate that they be, in fact, dedicated to the educational system. But if we can't, and I tell this to all the folks here from the Portland School District, if you can't get the 2% kicker into play, your high point budget is probably the $4 billion, $50 million budget that the Republicans put out last week. And it might not even be that high because that budget is funded by, I think, draconian cuts in some human service programs that probably need to be bought back.
I know we're not allowed follow-ups, but since I'm standing here, does that message help coming from us to legislators that aren't ours? Ours are sold.
I think there's a few key legislators out in Washington County that probably need to hear that message.
Governor, Thane Jensen, City Club member. Following up in the same vein as a lot of the previous questions, certainly a compelling case can be made that the unintended beneficiaries of Measure 5 and Measure 47, to a large extent, have been the business and corporate community. Certainly, the statistics bear out the fact that looking at the total revenues we realize through our tax dollars over Oregon, the proportion of it paid by the business and corporate community has diminished substantially over the last 20 years. Is it time for a radical tax overhaul of our existing system in Oregon? You're an enormously popular governor, and I think you've got a message that the people would listen to. I recognize you've got a hostile legislature, but just maybe carrying a message about looking at the overall structure of our tax system is in order. What do you think?
Well, excuse me. I think the answer is we do need a thoughtful reevaluation of the tax system. That was an issue that I raised during my campaign. It's a matter of when you take that on. And I guess I don't think it's going to happen this legislative session. I don't think that for a couple reasons. One, I don't think there's the desire to do that in the legislature at this point in time. But also, I think with 47, that is a huge change in the tax system. We need to give that at least enough time to settle out so we know what the tax system looks like. I think the 99 session is the session when we're going to have to take that on. And we're going to have to take it on if for no other reason, and you'll hear this, I think, in response to my proposal today, is that we have a budget that's not sustainable. That is, if you look at the rate of growth of our current budget, it outgrows the projected revenues to some extent. But you have to understand why that is. And the reason is that we have reduced the tax base for schools by cutting property taxes, which is money that went back to taxpayers, and then the state has been asked to pick that up, so that we have shifted a huge responsibility for schools. And I think that if we can get a responsible level of funding for education in this biennium, which I believe we have to do, we are going to be forced into a larger tax debate in 1999, driven by the question, how do we fund primary and secondary education? And that is the opportunity when we need to look at the equity in the system and the progressivity in the system, and we need to look at whether the incentives and disincentives are what we want to help the businesses that we want in this state. It's something we need to do, and if I'm around, this is not an announcement, I will certainly make that a very high priority.
Connie Powell, City Club member. Governor, I have a question about the cigarette tax ballot that passed that established a 30-cent cigarette tax to fund the Oregon Health Plan. And in your comments, I thought you suggested that legislators are considering using these funds as discretionary monies. My question is sort of an embarrassing, naive civics question. Are they legally able to rethink the use of these funds? And if so, are they operating in a political climate that makes this possible?
No, it's not a naive question at all. It's not intuitively obvious how this works. Basically, the ballot measure dedicates the 30-cent increase to 90% of it to the health plan and 10% to a program to prevent juveniles from beginning to smoke. Probably some of the most best spent dollars if we do that right. Essentially what will happen is it goes into the general fund. They will spend the 30 cents, the revenue from that, on the health plan, and let's say that's $140 million, but then they will back out $110 or $115 million from the general fund that also goes to the health plan. So most of the health plan is supported currently by the state general fund, by the income tax revenues, and a small portion of it by the cigarette tax. And so you can comply with the will of the voters by putting the cigarette tax money into the health plan and simply backing out the money. Then the result then is you don't have much of an increase, and you free up resources to balance other portions of the general fund budget. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Kitzhaber. We fervently hope you will be around to lead us into the next century. And we hope all of you will be around next week when we discuss patient protection in an age of HMOs. We are adjourned.